Section 9 of Captain Cook by Walter Besant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 6. Cook's First Voyage, Part 1. We have now cleared the way for a right understanding of Cook's voyages and their results. We have seen the Pacific Ocean at first, a great black sheet, streaked with thin belts of light as one voyager after the other ventured across. On the north of the equator, along the parallel of 13 degrees north, there is a broad belt. This is the highway between Panama and Manila. In spite of many voyages, there is still little light upon the Central and South Pacific. By far, the greater part of the ocean is covered with thick darkness. In considering these expeditions, one is faced by certain difficulties which do not apply to the earlier voyages. It is that they belong almost to our own time, that their history has been narrated over and over again. Every boy has read Cook's voyages. Not only every library, but almost every house with a row of bookshelves contains some account of them. There are cheap and popular editions. There are illustrated editions. They have been abridged, condensed, and castigated for the use of the young. They have served for lectures illustrated by the magic lantern. They are known in scraps by everybody. That is to say, though few of us would sit down to pass an examination on the subject, we all know in general terms that Cook surveyed the coasts of New Zealand and New Holland, penetrated the Southern Ocean, traversed the Pacific in every direction, and was finally murdered at the island which some of us, still faithful to tradition, call Owyhee. Again, all the anecdotes, the interesting facts, the dramatic bits have long since been picked out over and over again, so that they cannot be reproduced with the slightest show of freshness. Cook is not yet so old that, like Dampier and Shelvocke, only historical geographers and the people who read everything know him. Nor is he still so young that his achievements may bear another description by a new hand. He is, again, not yet so old but that men are still living who have conversed with survivors of the crews of Wallis, Carteret, and Cook. A man of 25 on board the Endeavour in 1768 would be no more than 77 in 1820. A man of 25 on board the Resolution in 1779 might live to reach 86 in 1840. There are among us some who can still remember the year 1820, and many who can remember the year 1840. It is indeed wonderful how far back one can reach in this way. It is not very long since some of Nelson's old tar still lingered, and lightened the tedium of time spent in sitting on a bench in the common hard above the logs by telling over again the story of the battles they had fought and the victories they had won. Nay, there might have been among them, perchance, as late as 1850, some more aged man who had witnessed from the boats of the Resolution the murder on the beach of Owyhee. There may have been a solitary survivor or two of that tragedy lingering on in their 90s. And as to grandsons of those hardy mariners, there are many still living, though unfortunately none of the great captain himself. Considering this difficulty, therefore, it will be prudent not to follow each of these voyages in detail, seeing that to do so would be to present a tale 10 times told already, but to draw up a skeleton route or course of each in turn, with such illustrations as may be gathered not so much from the official journals and descriptions which have been used over and over again, but from such other contemporary documents as are not generally known or are not easily accessible, and especially such illustrations as serve to show the personal character of the commander himself and the kind of company which manned his ships. As for the places which he visited and the people whom he brought to light, are they not described already in the books? We are not here considering the manners and customs of the Polynesians. Their origin, language, religion, folklore, and relationships do not concern us. The Royal Society, discovering that there would happen a transit of Venus in the year 1769, and that this interesting astronomical event would be best observed from some place in the Pacific Ocean, drew up a memorial to the king, praying that an expedition might be sent out with that object. They proposed, as the most convenient station of any then known, the islands of Rotterdam, Amsterdam, or the Marquesas. The memorial was favourably received, and the king consented to grant a ship properly provisioned and equipped to carry out any scientific observer who should be appointed by the society. Mr. Alexander Dalrymple, a well-known student and writer on geography and fellow of the society, was at first proposed as the commander of the scientific expedition. He consented to go, thinking that he should not only lead the scientific party, but would also command the ship, as had been done on a previous occasion, when Dr. Halley, for scientific purposes, was put in command of a ship with brevet rank as captain. But the Admiralty, also bearing in mind the example of Dr. Halley and its results in mutiny and disorders, refused absolutely to put another landsman with no knowledge whatever of discipline in command of a ship. On so long a voyage the results would certainly be far worse than on that occasion. Sir Edward Hawke, then at the head of the Admiralty, plainly declared that he would cut off his right hand rather than sign a commission for a person who was not a sailor. Then Mr. Dalrymple first refused to go at all, and then wanted to go, and finally, when it was too late, seems to have sulked, and ever afterwards complained that he had been badly treated by the Admiralty. They then cast about for an officer who could not only command the ship, but also conduct the scientific purpose of the expedition. No other man could be found than James Cook, master in the Royal Navy. Everything happened fortunately and opportunely for him. He had just returned from the important post of surveyor of Newfoundland and Labrador. He was therefore available and on the spot. He had brought himself into great notice by his admirable charts, and he was well recommended by every officer under whom he had served. It is indeed most probable that no other officer in the navy possessed so much scientific knowledge as Cook. To have mastered the whole art of navigation with the methods and tactics of naval warfare in all its branches was then considered an education sufficient for the best and most ambitious officer. Yet one doubts whether Cook would have received the appointment had either Wallis or Carteret returned in time. Their experience of the Pacific would have outweighed Cook's proved zeal, intelligence, and scientific attainments. However, Cook was recommended by Mr. Stephens, secretary to the Admiralty, and no other officer seems to have been considered at all. Certainly the command of an expedition, not warlike, from which no glory of the usual kind could be obtained, certain to be long and tedious, and equally certain to be full of dangers and discomforts, was not a post for which backstairs influence would be employed or favouritism brought into request. Cook accepted the offer eagerly and instantly. It was indeed an enormous step upwards. He was taken out of the master's line, from which there was seldom any promotion possible, and placed into the higher branch. He received the rank of lieutenant. In his introduction to the narrative of the second voyage, Cook explains what kind of ship is best for the successful conduct of such enterprises. He says, "The success will more chiefly depend on the kind, the size, and the properties of the ships chosen for the service, as the greatest danger to be apprehended and provided against on a voyage of discovery, especially to the most distant parts of the globe, is that of the ships being liable to be run aground on an unknown desert, or perhaps savage coast. So no consideration should be set in competition with that of her being of a construction of the safest kind, in which the officers may, with the least hazard, venture upon a strange coast. A ship of this kind must not be of a great draught of water, yet of a sufficient burden and capacity to carry a proper quantity of provisions and necessaries for her complement of men, and for the term requisite to perform the voyage. She must also be of a construction that will bear to take the ground, and of a size which, in case of necessity, may be safely and conveniently laid on shore to repair any accidental damage or defect. These properties are not to be found in ships of war of 40 guns. nor in frigates, nor in East India Company ships, nor in large 3-decked West India ships, nor indeed in any other but North Country built ships, as such as are built for the coal trade, which are peculiarly adapted for this purpose. After this expression of opinion, written, it is true, after his experience on the first voyage, it is not surprising to learn that his first ship, the Endeavour, was in fact a collier, built by his old friends of Whitby, a stout, strong ship designed for safety in all weathers rather than for speed. Her like still sails between the northern ports and London. She herself, until a few years ago, carried on at a very advanced age the trade for which she was originally constructed. She was of 370 tons. The scientific party consisted of Mr. Charles Green, one of the assistants to the Astronomer Royal, Joseph Banks, afterwards Sir Joseph, a man of large private means, and already of considerable scientific reputation, Dr. Solander, one of the assistants of the British Museum. Banks brought with him a naturalist, Mr. Sidney Parkinson, a draughtsman, and others as assistants. The Endeavour's complement consisted of 85 men in all, including the captain, 2 lieutenants, 3 midshipmen, a master surgeon, boatswain, carpenter, and the other petty officers, with 41 able seamen, 12 marines, and 9 servants. She took on board 10 carriage and 12 swivel guns, and was provisioned for 18 months. Before the Endeavour was fitted out, Captain Wallis returned, bringing the news of the discovery of Otaheite. George Forster, of the second voyage, spells it Otaheite, which is nearer to its new name of Tahiti, and as the place seemed more convenient than the Marquesas for astronomical observation, it was determined that the transit should be observed from Otaheite. The Endeavour was fitted in the basin of Deptford Dockyard, July 30th, 1768. She sailed from Deptford, and on August 26th, the wind being fair, she put to sea from Plymouth. The superstitious may remark that this most successful voyage of discovery was commenced on a Friday. The only account of the voyage is that published officially. Most unfortunately, it is not the work of Cook himself or of Banks, whose journals were extremely voluminous. It is a clumsy compilation by Dr. Hawkesworth, into whose hands were placed all the journals, logs, and other papers connected with the voyages of Byron, Wallis, Carteret, and Cook, the first voyage only of the last named. It was fondly thought that this writer, then a well-known litterateur, would be able to present the separate journals in a narrative possessing the graces of literary style. This the doctor undertook to do, with the understanding that he was at liberty to decorate the naked narrative with remarks or sentiments of his own proper to the occasion. As the narrative is written in the first person, as if by the respective officers whose names stand at the head of each history, the result is truly wonderful. It must be owned that the author of this literary job was careful to preserve every incident recorded in the journals, yet their mode of presentment robbed the journals entirely of the personal element which is the chief charm in all books of travel. Wallis and Carteret have disappeared altogether. Cook himself is invisible under the classic garments with which he is arrayed. The sentiments, it is true, are beautiful. There is a display of learning which makes the memory of the free love of Whitby seem like a bad dream. Cook must surely have been wandering all these years on the banks of Granta. For instance, how judicious is the rendering of such a simple incident as that described in the following passage. The scene might possibly have become more curious and interesting if it had not suddenly been interrupted by an interlude of a more serious kind. Just at this time, Dr. Solander complained that his pockets had been picked. Of course, Captain Cook, in his culpable carelessness of style, had made the simple entry, Solander had his pocket picked. When we read of the poetical fables of Arcadia, of the famous purpur of the ancients, we feel the felicity of passing Cook through a classical mill. And what polite ear can endure to be told that the captain went about with the king, when it is possible to say that the commander pursued his journey under the auspices of that potentate. The ship's log, again, should be kept in balanced sentences. Witness the following, which forms part of a classical account of a boxing match between two savages. We observed with pleasure that the conqueror never exulted over the vanquished, and that the vanquished never repined at the success of the conqueror. And the following is a charming illustration of the lofty and refined level on which a sailor's log ought to be maintained. It is scarcely possible for those who are acquainted with the athletic sports of remote antiquity not to remark a rude resemblance of them in this wrestling match among the natives of a little island in the midst of the Pacific Ocean, and our female readers may recollect the account given of them by Fenelon in his Telemachus, where, though the events are fictitious, the manners of the age are faithfully transcribed from authors by whom they are supposed to have been truly related. All this written by Captain Cook in Matavai Bay. After this, it no longer surprises us to hear him reminding us how Aelian and Apollonius Rhodius impute a certain practice to the ancient inhabitants of Colchis, a country near Pontus in Asia, now called Mingrelia. End of section 9. Section 10 of Captain Cook by Walter Besant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 6. Cook's First Voyage, Part 2. In spite of all, the story of Cook's first voyage proved the most interesting account of adventure and discovery ever yet presented to English readers. For the reason already given, I do not propose to make long extracts from it. The following is the skeleton course of the ship. August 26th, 1768. The Endeavour set sail from Plymouth Sound. September 13th, Madeira. The narrative speaks of kindness and hospitality received there. Mr. George Forster darkly hints at a discreet silence being thrown over a certain bombardment of Fort Lewis, Madeira, by an English man of war, assisted by Captain Cook, in revenge for an insult offered to the British flag. Perhaps, who knows? November 13th, Rio de Janeiro. January 14th, 1769. Entered the Strait of Le Maire. The ship doubled Cape Horn and arrived off the western end of the Magellan Strait in 33 days, the ship having sustained no damage. April 10th. Sighted Otaheite, having on the run from Cape Horn discovered several small islands, namely Lagoon Island, Thurnal Cape, Bow Island, the Groups, Bird Island, and Chain Island. April 13th. Anchored in Matavai Bay. June 1st. Transit of Venus successfully observed. July 13th. Left Otaheite, cruised among the islands of the group, landed on those called by Cook Huaheine, Bolabola, Ulietea, Otaha, Tubai, and Morua. October 7th. New Zealand sighted. The whole of the coast of New Zealand was examined, the country being proved to consist of 2 islands and to form no part of the great southern continent. 6 months were given to this work. March 31st, 1770. Sailed from New Zealand. April 28th. Anchored in Botany Bay. Cook then followed up the coast of Australia northward for 2,000 miles. August 25th. Left the coast of New South Wales and steered for the coast of New Guinea. Passed through Torres Strait and established the fact that New Guinea and New Holland are separate islands. Touched at Timor, Savo, and Batavia. June 12th, 1771. Anchored in the Downs. The results of this voyage have been summed up as follows by Cook himself in the introduction to his account of the second voyage. I was ordered to proceed directly to Otaheite, and after astronomical observations should be completed, to prosecute the design of making discoveries in the South Pacific Ocean by proceeding to the south as far as latitude 40°, Then, if I found no land, to proceed to the west between 40° and 35° till I fell in with New Zealand, which I was to explore, and thence to return to England by such route as I should think proper. In the prosecution of these instructions I sailed from Deptford the 30th July 1768, from Plymouth the 26th of August, touched at Madeira, Rio de Janeiro, and Strait Le Maire, and entered the South Pacific Ocean by Cape Horn in January the following year. I endeavoured to make a direct course to Otaheite, and in part succeeded, but I made no discovery till I got within the tropic, where I fell in with Lagoon Island, the Groups, Bird Island, Chain Island, and on the 13th of April arrived at Otaheite, where I remained 3 months, during which time the observations on the transit were taken. I then left it, discovered and visited the Society Islands and Ohetoroa, thence proceeded to the south, till I arrived in latitude 40° 22' south, longitude 147° 29' west, and on the 6th of October fell in with the east side of New Zealand. I continued exploring the coast of this country till the 31st of March 1770, when I quitted it and proceeded to New Holland, and having surveyed the eastern coast of that vast country, which part had not before been visited, I passed between its northern extremity and New Guinea, landed on the latter, touched at the island of Savu, Batavia, Cape of Good Hope, and St. Helena, and arrived in England on the 2nd of July 1771. The publication of the journals of this voyage was looked for with the greatest eagerness. As might be expected, the official narrative was anticipated by productions written hastily and without the maps and charts. One of them was anonymous, the work of someone who had been on board and concealed his name. The other was the journal of Banks' draughtsman, Mr. Sidney Parkinson, a copy of which was obtained surreptitiously. This, which was enriched by Parkinson's drawings, was suppressed by an injunction. Hawkesworth's narrative was not published until after Cook's departure for the second voyage. He asserts, no doubt with perfect truth, that he submitted it to Cook for perusal before he went away, and to Banks before publication. Everything, it is certain, was there. He had omitted no incident either from Cook's or Banks' journals, but the work as it appeared belonged neither to Cook nor to Banks. Apart from the immense body of new geographical work accomplished in the voyage, it is remarkable for having led to a more successful method of treating that terrible scourge of every voyage, scurvy. We have seen how Wallis treated it. In the account of the second voyage we shall see how Cook treated it. But on this his first voyage, and perhaps his first long voyage, unless we count the passage of the Atlantic a long voyage, he seems to have had no experience of scurvy, and to have taken no special precautions. The experience of Byron, whose company suffered horribly from this scourge, could not have been unknown to him. Byron returned in 1766, 2 years before the Endeavour sailed, and although his journals had not yet been published, the Admiralty had all the information, and could hardly withhold a fact so important as the prostration of half the crew. Nothing, however, is said of special precautions. Moreover, very little is said about scurvy during the first part of the voyage, when they were seldom, after the 6 weeks' run from Cape Horn to Tahiti, many days from land. On their return voyage, however, after leaving Batavia, where the whole company seemed to have been poisoned by the heat and the stinks of the place, scurvy and fever together fell upon the crew, so that 40 were on the sick list. Out of the 40, 23 died. This dreadful calamity, the sight of all the suffering, impressed Cook so much that in future we shall find him taking as much thought for the prevention of scurvy as for the prosecution of the enterprise in hand, and after the second voyage he was as much congratulated on his success in this respect as on his achievements as an explorer of unknown seas. The death list indeed was frightful. The astronomer Charles Green died, the surgeon Monkhouse died, the first lieutenant Hicks died. Among others who died were Sporing and Parkinson, both of Banks's party, 2 midshipmen, the master, a young man of good parts, but unhappily given up to intemperance, which brought on disorders that put an end to his life. The boatswain, the carpenter, his mate, and 2 of his crew, the sailmaker, a good old man of 70 who had kept himself from fever in Batavia by getting drunk every day, and his mate, the corporal of marines, the cook, and in all about a dozen seamen. This was a goodly roll out of a company of 80. But this was the last voyage in which scurvy was to demand such an enormous proportion of victims. Cook was going to prove the best physician ever known in the prevention of scurvy. The only true method of prevention, however, the mode of preserving every variety of fresh food, was not discovered for a long time afterwards. Mr. Clark Russell has remarked in his Life of Dampier that in those days they oversalted the beef and pork. The remark is equally true of the provisions served out in Cook's time. They were oversalted. George Forster of the second voyage complains bitterly of the time when the private stores of the officers and passengers were exhausted, and they had to live on the ship's provisions just like the crew. He tells us how every day the sight and smell of the salt junk that was served to them made them loathe their food, which besides was so hard that there was neither nourishment nor flavour left in it. Imagine the misery, the solid misery, of having to live upon nothing but a fibrous mass of highly salted animal matter, accompanied by rotten and weevily biscuit. Think of this going on day after day for 100 days, and sometimes more at a stretch. 3 long months, with no bread, vegetables, butter, or fruit, even the water gone bad, and no tea, coffee, or cocoa. It seems a slight to the memory of Captain Cook to dismiss his first voyage with so scant a notice, but indeed Dr. Hawkesworth has taken the commander out of the narrative so completely that nothing remains of him but his shadow who moves and acts. We never catch his eye, we never hear him speak. As the captain, so the company. The followers of Captain Jason himself, or the crew who threw Jonah into the waves, are hardly more shadowy than the crew of the Endeavour. We may dismiss this first voyage with one more remark. When a voyage of discovery is sent out in these days, most places are supposed to be so well known as to require no detailed description, though observations may be made on points of new or special interest. This was not so with Cook. He, or Dr. Banks, or Dr. Hawkesworth, thinks it necessary to give descriptions of every place the ship visited. Madeira, the Cape of Good Hope, and Batavia require a description almost as full and complete as Otaheite, New Zealand, and the coast of New Holland. This is fortunate for us. Many things have been changed since then, especially in Batavia, where it is hoped they no longer punish their malefactors by impalement, nor do their ladies flog and torture their female slaves out of jealousy. The colonial government has also perhaps learned a little civility and hospitality, and one would like to learn that they have cleaned up the place a little. But the account of the Dutch colony and that of Cape Town are most valuable as contemporary pictures of a kind of life now passed away. Every one who has endeavoured to reconstruct life as it was 100 or 200 years ago must know how extraordinarily difficult it is to find records exact and minute. Cook's or Banks' or Hawkesworth's notes on Batavia will always be as useful to one considering colonial ways in the last century as to those who study Polynesian manners, customs, language, and tradition at the moment of their discovery. Many stories told of this voyage greatly affected the popular imagination. I have not quoted any of them for reasons already stated. The night of terror and freezing cold spent by Banks and his companions on a hillside of Tierra del Fuego in the height of the Antarctic summer, the soft and gentle manners of the Otaheitans, whose ladies, though not so beautifully dressed, reminded the tender-hearted mariners in many particulars of Poll and Doll and Moll, those fair maids of Point and St. Mary Street, the fierce New Zealanders, the vast island of New Holland, so thinly populated, bigger, they said, than the whole of Europe, Heavens, what treasures must be waiting in that vast unexplored country! The perils of the Endeavour among the coral reefs, the lovely island of Savu, the luxury and drunkenness, the cruelty, the vice, the heat, the stinks, the fever of Batavia — all these things enlarged the narrow world and filled men with wonder and delight, so that they held out their hands, and with one common consent they called for more. End of Section 10. Section 11 of Captain Cook by Walter Besant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7. A Breathing Space. Cook returned home on June 12, 1771. In his absence, a day or two before he sailed out of Plymouth, a child had been born to him, but it died in infancy. He also learned that his second child, Elizabeth, born in 1766, was dead. Footnote. No one who gets acquainted with the family life of the last century can avoid remarking the great number of children who died. Thus Cook lost 4 at least of his brothers and sisters in childhood. He also lost 3 out of 6 of his own children. Yet his brothers lived in the healthiest part of England, and his children in the open country a mile from Aldgate. His own constitution was of iron, and his wife lived to be more than 90, so that there was no hereditary weakness. End footnote. His wife was living at Mile End Old Town, a name given both to the few scattered houses along that part of the Mile End Road where is now the People's Palace, and to the houses on the east side, the old side of Stepney Green. The house now pointed out as Cook's is number 88 Mile End Road, a small and rather mean house at present, one of a row of shops. The more respectable residents of the Mile End Road were retired masters of merchant vessels, or the grass widows of skippers still in active work. It would seem, however, as if there was little leisure for anything but business. He had first to put in order and to deliver to the Admiralty all his notes, journals, log books, and observations, with drawings and charts. This done, he might have sat down to rest a while. Perhaps he did, but his power of taking rest was less than that usually granted to man. At all events, he found time to write a paper for the Royal Society called An Account of the Flowing of the Tides in the South Sea, as observed on board His Majesty's bark the Endeavour. This paper, as well as one on the scientific results of the voyage, was published by the Society in their Philosophical Transactions. Cook was promoted to the rank of commander. He hoped, it is said, to have been made a post-captain, but this was not allowed. To us it seems a very small thing whether Cook should rank as a commander or as a post-captain. The greatness of a man's achievement is not to be measured by his promotion, or even by the recognition of his own contemporaries, though in general a man's own contemporaries generally overestimate the achievements of their leaders, as boys at school think the greatest man in the world is the captain of their 11. Besides, there is in every age a fashion in the conferring of rank and promotion. In these days we have seen the greatest traveller of the age rewarded after he had reached the age of 60 with a simple knighthood. We have also seen, and it greatly increases our admiration for the national honours, the owners of great incomes created peers. In those days they reserved their peerages first for the men who defeated the French by sea or land, next for the younger sons of noblemen who distinguished themselves as statesmen, and lastly for lawyers. The immeasurable importance of the gifts which Cook had bestowed upon his country was such as to require the prophetic gift, the supreme wisdom, to recognize it. And surely there was little of that wisdom in the statesman of 1770. He had given to his country Australia and New Zealand, nothing less. He had given to Great Britain Greater Britain. If people had only suspected or guessed 1,000th part of what was to come out of this voyage, what reward would have been thought too great? Cook got no title, and I am quite certain expected none. He humbly hoped to be made a post-captain, and he had been contented with a single step. Let us hope that he was satisfied. The man is silent. We cannot tell what he hoped, or whether he was satisfied with what he got. There is only one document of his extant in which he is allowed to say the word he intended, and in that document he says nothing about his hopes or his ambitions. He was at home this time for exactly a year, but if the beginning of his leave was spent in preparing papers for the Admiralty, the end of it was fully occupied in preparing for another voyage to the same regions. It was a great thing in those days to have put a girdle round the earth, and it was such a painful and laborious thing, so full of discomforts and anxieties, that there were few who cared to attempt the feat a second time. Meantime, the smouldering controversy about the great southern continent began again to rage vehemently. In 1770 appeared the first volume of Dalrymple's collection of voyages, which started the dispute afresh. The recent voyage of Captain Cook had not, it was true, succeeded in finding that continent. On the other hand, he had not looked for it. His discoveries in respect to New Holland and New Zealand did not in the least disprove its existence. They only shifted the ground where it might lie. The believers in the continent were not in the least degree disposed to surrender their terra australis incognita because Cook had not found it. Such a beautiful land, round which had been woven so many pleasing speculations, was not lightly to be abandoned. For 200 years the southern continent had been believed in. It will be found laid down with much precision on many of the old maps. Wherever bits of land, capes, corners, and angles, nay, even islands were discovered, they were set down on the map as part of the great southern continent. Tasman, for instance, thought that the corner of New Zealand discovered by himself belonged to it. Lozier Bouvet, sent out by the French East India Company in 1738, reported land in latitude 54 degrees south and longitude 11 degrees east. This land, it has never been found by any subsequent traveller, was also concluded to be part of the continent. And early in 1675, an English merchant, Anthony Laroche, being carried out of his course by winds and currents, fell in with a coast now supposed to have been the island of Georgia, which was also concluded to be the southern continent. The discoveries of Quiros again pointed the same way. Given the existence of such a continent, and all these discoveries could be easily connected with it. In fact, they were, and every additional spot of land observed from a ship driven southwards by bad weather became an addition to the coast of the continent. Dr. Kippis, Cook's biographer, writing in the year 1788, thus speaks of this belief. The writer of this narrative fully remembers how much his imagination was captivated in the more early part of his life with the hypothesis of a southern continent. He has often dwelt upon it with rapture, and been highly delighted with the authors who contended for its existence, and displayed the mighty consequences which would result from its being discovered. Though his knowledge was infinitely exceeded by that of some able men who had paid a particular attention to the subject, he did not come behind them in the sanguineness of his hopes and expectations. In short, the southern continent was the thing which had grown up in men's minds until to many who thought and wrote about it, the great unknown land stretched round the whole of the Antarctic pole. It contained treasures greater than any which had been found in the Americas. It was populated by a race highly civilized, who had acquired a knowledge of the arts. It would be a possession for that European nation which should find and claim it, greater and richer than was ever the Spanish dominions in the West. Its longitude, see Dalrymple's collection, is as much as that of all Europe, Asia Minor, and to the Caspian Sea and Persia, with all the islands of the Mediterranean and Ocean which are in its limits embraced, including England and Ireland. That unknown part is a quarter of the whole globe, and so capacious that it may contain in it double the kingdoms and provinces of all those your Majesty is at present lord of, and that without adjoining to Turks or Moors or others of the nations which are accustomed to disquiet and disturb their neighbours. Dalrymple, himself an ardent advocate of the southern continent, thus dedicates his historical collection of voyages to the man who, emulous of Magellan and the heroes of former times, undeterred by difficulties and unseduced by pleasure, shall persist through every obstacle, and not by chance, but by virtue and good conduct, succeed in establishing an intercourse with the southern continent. The Earl of Sandwich, at that time the First Lord of the Admiralty, took a great interest in these questions. It seems to have been chiefly due to him that an expedition was resolved upon which should endeavour to clear up and finally settle the controversy concerning the continent. How far Cook himself was consulted does not appear. In Cook's own words, "Soon after my return in the Endeavour, it was resolved to equip 2 ships to complete the discovery of the southern hemisphere." That he was consulted as to the conduct and equipment of the voyage is evident from his introduction to the second voyage, in which he discusses — the passage has already been quoted — the kind of vessel most useful for such a voyage, and shows that his advice was acted upon. It does not appear that there was ever any hesitation on the part of Lord Sandwich as to the proper person to command the new expedition. I know not where Captain Wallis was at this time, or Captain Carteret, but both were passed over, and the command was offered to Cook. He accepted it without hesitation. The date of his commission was November 28th, 1771. The interval of 5 months was therefore all the time he had to bestow upon his family, and this interval, as we have seen, must have been pretty well occupied with business relating to the last voyage. From the time of his appointment he must have been fully occupied with the preparations and the equipment of his ships, so that the family at Mile End Old Town saw but little of their father. As in the case of the former voyage, a child was born a few days after the departure of the ships, and, as before, the child died in infancy. The disasters of the previous voyage caused Cook to take many new precautions against scurvy. He put on board wheat instead of oatmeal, sugar instead of so much oil, and a quantity of malt, sauerkraut, salted cabbage, portable broth, saloup, rob of lemons, mustard, marmalade of carrots, and inspissated juice of wort and beer. Some of these things were experimental and failed to produce any good effect. Others were well known for their antiscorbutic properties. In fact, for the first time in the history of navigation, a carefully prepared attempt was to be made in the prevention of this disease. When all was ready, the ship sailed from Deptford on April 9th, 1772, but being detained by east winds got no further than Woolwich, where she lay for a fortnight. She then dropped down to Longreach, but had to put in for repairs at Sheerness. On June 22nd she sailed for Plymouth, and finally quitted Plymouth Sound on July 13th. End of section 11. Section 12 of Captain Cook by Walter Besant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8. The Second Voyage, Part 1. One opens the account of the second voyage with relief and hope. We have done with Dr. Hawkesworth. It is true that we have Dr. Douglas in his place, but the second editor declares solemnly that he has given the very words of the writer without alteration. This is substantially true. There may be omissions, but the language is never altered, nor shall we find inserted any of the judicious observations. If anywhere we shall find the man himself in this journal, we shall hear his voice and look into his face and read his mind. Certainly Cook was not brought up in a school which encourages personal confidences and bits of autobiography. We must not expect too much, but we are all human, and except in a Royal Engineer's report, which is written in the third person, a man may discover himself even in a ship's journal or a log-book. One may even discern the character of a clergyman from his manner of keeping a parish register. When one reads this narrative, it is truly wonderful to understand how any one would have thought of improving Cook's style by subjecting it to the handling of Dr. Hawkesworth. What have balanced periods, turgid ornaments, and becoming sentiments to do with Cook's plain unvarnished narrative? Simplicity and directness never go out of fashion. We read a book of travels to learn what was observed and discovered, not to linger over the sentences, caught by the charm of the words or dwelling on the music of a phrase. Nay, to the charm of literary style the greater part of the world will always remain blind and deaf. They read for what is told, not for the way in which it is told. They want the story. The skilful artist may so employ his charm of language as to make the manner seem part and parcel of the matter, but the story is everything. In such a story as Cook had to tell, the greatest simplicity and the most perfect directness are the most effective and the most desirable qualities. The reader should have no other thought than to learn what he saw and whither he sailed. Cook's own journal, then, is here presented in his own words. He says simply in his introduction, "And now it may be necessary to say that as I am on the point of sailing on a third expedition, I leave this account of my last voyage in the hands of some friends, who in my absence have kindly accepted the office of correcting the press for me, who are pleased to think that what I have here to relate is better to be given in my own words than in the words of another person, especially as it is a work designed for information and not merely for amusement, in which it is their opinion that candour and fidelity will counterbalance the want of ornament. I shall therefore conclude this introductory discourse with desiring the reader to excuse the inaccuracies of style which doubtless he will frequently meet with in the following narrative, and that when such occur he will recollect that it is the production of a man who has not had the advantage of much school education, but who has been constantly at sea from his youth, and though with the assistance of a few good friends he has passed through all the stations belonging to a seaman, from an apprentice in the coal trade to a post-captain in the Royal Navy, he has had no opportunity of cultivating letters. After this account of myself, the public must not expect from me the elegance of a fine writer or the plausibility of a professed bookmaker, but will, I hope, consider me as a plain man, zealously exerting myself in the service of his country, and determined to give the best account he is able of his proceedings." These words are straightforward, modest, and manly. The writer is not ashamed of having risen from the lowest position possible on a ship. On the other hand, he is prepared to maintain his own ability to set down what he has seen as plainly as if he had had as many opportunities of cultivating letters as the great man who was appointed to revise his simple and direct account. Besides Cook's own account, we have, to illustrate this voyage, a description written by George Forster, younger of the two German naturalists who accompanied the expedition, certain observations by the elder Forster, and the scientific results detailed by Wallace and Bailey, the two astronomers. Forster's book, which appeared in 1777, was regarded as a breach of confidence. His father, to whom he was assistant, was sent out as naturalist, with general instructions to make observations of every kind. He also seems to have thought that he would be called upon to write the history of the voyage, to succeed the great Hawkesworth. On his return he still imagined that he would be expected to do this, and actually began it, but found that the captain's journal was to be kept separate from his own. Lord Sandwich, however, undertook to present Cook and Forster with the plates, engraved at the expense of the Admiralty, of all the drawings and maps made during the voyage to accompany the journals, and Forster was informed that he would not be called upon to write the history of the voyage at all, but to send in his observations as they were. Unless he agreed to do this, he would forfeit any share in the profits of the work. Here the son saw his chance. He was not bound, he said, by any agreement which his father had made. He therefore wrote his own account of the voyage, and on the whole, though somewhat flowery and exaggerated, it is a very good book indeed. The government and Captain Cook unfortunately took a different view of his obligation, and it is said expressed these views so strongly that the two Forsters found that no further appointments would be offered them, and retired to their native country, where I know not what became of them. The father is said to have been of a turbulent temper. The son grumbled throughout the voyage at the loss of his little comforts, but Cook has no word of complaint against either of them, nor have they any other charge against the captain than that he would persevere with the work before him, though it made his people more uncomfortable every day. 2 ships were chosen and fitted out for this expedition. Both of them were built at Whitby, on much the same lines as the Endeavour. They were at the time about 14 or 16 months old. One of them, the Resolution, was of 462 tons burden, the other, the Adventure, of 336 tons. The former was fitted out at Deptford, the latter at Woolwich. The Resolution carried a company of 112 men, the Adventure 81. Each ship was provisioned for 2 years and a half. We have seen how, mindful of his late disasters, Cook carried with him a great quantity of anti-scorbutics. The frame of a small vessel of 20 tons was put on board each ship, to be put together and to serve as tenders on any emergency, such as shipwreck. Both ships were provided with a quantity of things such as the natives would like for presents or trade. A number of medals were struck, on one side the king's head, and on the other the 2 ships. Warm clothing was laid in. The scientific branch of the expedition was provided for first, by placing an astronomer, provided by the Board of Longitude, with proper instruments, in each ship. Mr. Wallace was on the Resolution, and Mr. Bailey on the Adventure. Footnote: the following is a list of the instruments supplied. It may be curious to compare it with such as would now be supplied: a portable observatory, 2 astronomical clocks, a transit instrument, an astronomical quadrant, a reflecting telescope of 2 feet focal length, an achromatic refracting telescope of 3½ feet, 2 Hadley sextants, an azimuth compass, a pair of globes, a dipping needle, a marine barometer, a wind gauge, 2 portable barometers, 6 thermometers, a theodolite with a level and a chain, an apparatus for testing the heat of the sea water at different depths, 4 timekeepers. End footnote. Mr. William Hodges, a landscape painter, was engaged to make drawings and paintings of places and people, and the 2 Germans, John Reinhold Forster and his son, George Forster, already spoken of, were engaged as skilful in natural history. As regards the ship's company, the 2nd and 3rd lieutenants, the lieutenant of marines, 2 of the warrant officers, and several of the petty officers on the Resolution had sailed with Cook on the Endeavour. That so many were ready to go with him again shows the confidence they placed in him, as well as his power of attracting the affection of his subordinates. The captain of the Adventure, Tobias Fourneau, had been Wallace's first lieutenant. On July 13th the ship sailed from Plymouth Sound. My instructions were to make the best of my way to the island of Madeira, there to take in a supply of wine, and then proceed to the Cape of Good Hope, where I was to refresh the ship's companies, and to take on board such provisions and necessaries as I might stand in need of. After leaving the Cape of Good Hope, I was to proceed to the southward, and endeavour to fall in with Cape Circumcision, which was said by M. Bouvet to lie in latitude 54° south, and in about 11° 20' east longitude from Greenwich. If I discovered this cape, I was to satisfy myself whether it was part of the continent which had so long engaged the attention of geographers and former navigators, or a part of an island. If it proved to be the former, I was to employ myself diligently in exploring as great an extent of it as I could, and to make such notations thereon and observations of every kind as might be useful either to navigation or commerce, or tend to the promotion of natural knowledge. I was also directed to observe the genius, temper, disposition, and number of the inhabitants, if there were any, and endeavour by all possible means to cultivate a friendship and alliance with them, making them presents of such things as they might value, inviting them to traffic, and showing them every kind of civility and regard. I was to continue to employ myself on this service, and making discoveries either eastward or westward as my situation might render most eligible, keeping in as high a latitude as I could, and prosecuting my discoveries as near to the South Pole as possible, so long as the condition of the ships, the health of their crews, and the state of their provisions would admit of, taking care to reserve as much of the latter as would enable me to reach some known port where I could procure a sufficiency to bring me home to England. But if Cape Circumcision should prove to be part of an island only, or if I should not be able to find the said cape, I was in the first case to make the necessary survey of the island, and then to stand on to the southward as long as I judged there was a likelihood of falling in with the continent, which I was also to do in the latter case, and then to proceed to the eastward in further search of the said continent, as well as to make discoveries of such islands as might be situated in that unexplored part of the southern hemisphere, keeping in high latitudes and prosecuting my discoveries as above mentioned as near the pole as possible, until I had circumnavigated the globe, after which I was to proceed to the Cape of Good Hope, and from thence to Spithead. In the prosecution of these discoveries, wherever the season of the year rendered it unsafe for me to continue in high latitudes, I was to retire to some known place to the northward to refresh my people and refit the ships, and to return again to the southward as soon as the season of the year would admit of it. In all unforeseen cases I was authorized to proceed according to my own discretion, and in case the Resolution should be lost or disabled, I was to prosecute the voyage on board the Adventure. There is shown at the Museum of Whitby, besides the boat yoke used by Cook, a so-called model of the Resolution. She is a stout vessel, 3-masted, broad in the beam, and built for strength before speed. One understands only by looking at her how the ship took 109 days to get from Plymouth to Table Bay on this voyage, and 99 days on the next. Her figurehead is a black savage with a spear and shield. She has no bulwarks, but this detail is clearly wrong. A strong timber railing runs round her, leaving her totally unprotected from the breaking of seas over her, which therefore would sweep her clean, as they now do on the Atlantic steamers. There is no waist and no high stern. Her upper deck is nearly flush, the quarter-deck being raised about a foot. There are no cabins or rooms on the upper deck, and there is no kind of protection for the sailors, so that in rough weather no one except the watch would be able to go on deck at all. A hatchway forward and another aft lead down to the main deck, on which were placed and worked the 26 guns for which she was pierced. It appears, however, that the model is inaccurate, because the Resolution carried no more than 12 and was only pierced for 16. On the main deck also must have been the workshops, as well as the mess tables, the officers' cabins, and the captain's room. Perhaps the men slung their hammocks here as well. The masts, if the model is faithful, were thick and stout, and so were the yards. One thinks of the company on board this little vessel. 112 men, all cooped up in this narrow space for a 3 years' voyage. There were, besides, livestock on board in great numbers to be landed on the islands: bulls, cows, rams, ewes, goats, fowls. Great indeed was the courage of our grandfathers. Smollett has shown us how they lived down below in the darkness and stench without too much grumbling. But Roderick Random's ship was not provisioned for 2 years, nor did it carry bulls and cows and sheep and goats. Anyone who has ever seen a cattle boat will appreciate the power of these innocent creatures to create for the sailors a special kind of misery. Perhaps in warm, soft climates, when the ports were open and the trade breeze blew gratefully through and through the ship, the men's quarters were fresh and sweet. But when she was plying painfully among the ice fields of the southern sea, when the ports were closed and the icy breath of the south drove the men below, when the sails were sheets of frozen canvas and every rope was covered with a thin sheathing of ice, then— But the crews were accustomed to discomfort. It was only the landsmen on board who made complaint. We will follow this voyage with the help of Mr. George Forster's book rather than that of the captain's journal, which everybody has read. It is a book in which we hear something of the daily talk among the passengers, if not among the crew. There are details in it which are below the dignity of the captain's journals. We see how those on board liked it who had no enthusiasm for the great southern continent. July 13th, 1772. Sailed from Plymouth Sound, touched at Port Praya, in the island of St. Jago. October 30th to November 22nd. Table Bay. Here Herr Sparmann, botanist and pupil of the great Linné, joined the expedition. On leaving the Cape, the men were served out jackets and trousers of stout flannel called fearnought. Orders were given not to waste the water, and everybody had to wash in salt water. Forster also mentions the discomfort caused by the rough weather, which they got here for the first time. On December 10th they sighted the ice. They were now in the longitude assigned by Bouvet to the headland which he claimed to have seen and named Cape Circumcision, but their latitude was 95 miles south of his, so that if they sailed over the land south of that cape, it could not very well belong to a continent. This, in fact, they afterwards did. For 6 weeks the ships sailed among icebergs, getting south whenever an opening appeared. 2 or 3 cases of scurvy were declared and cured by copious doses of fresh wort. The crews also took sauerkraut every day and had portable broth. Christmas Day was spent, Forster tells us, with the usual cheerfulness, by the officers and passengers, and by the sailors with savage noise and drunkenness, to which they seem to have particularly devoted the day. The naturalist was greatly affected by the situation in which he found himself. He speaks of the gloomy uniformity with which we slowly passed dull hours, days, and months in this desolate part of the world. We were almost perpetually wrapped in thick fogs, beaten with showers of rain, sleet, hail, and snow, surrounded by innumerable islands of ice, against which we daily ran the risk of being shipwrecked, and forced to live upon salt provisions, which concurred with the cold and wet to infect the mass of our blood. End of section 12. Section 13 of Captain Cook by Walter Besant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8. The Second Voyage, Part 2. The captain mentions the fog and sleet, and notes that the rigging was ornamented with icicles, but he says nothing about the dull hours, and what with watching the ice, sending out boats to look for openings, making experiments with his anti-scorbutics, and calculating longitudes, he seems to have found the time anything but dull. At last, however, being in latitude 67 degrees 15 minutes south, to Forster's great joy, they came upon such an immense field of ice that the captain concluded to try no more that season, and steered north. Very natural, says Forster, that our people, exhausted by fatigues and the want of wholesome food, should wish for a place of refreshment, and rejoice to leave a part of the world where they could not expect to meet with it. He says that there were now a good many cases of scurvy on board. The captain, on the contrary, says that there was but one. He means, of course, one case of importance. Thus ended, says Forster, when the ship arrived at New Zealand, our first cruise in the high southern latitudes. Our whole course from the Cape of Good Hope to New Zealand was a series of hardships which had never been experienced before. All the disagreeable circumstances of the sails and rigging shattered to pieces, the vessel rolling gunwale to, and her upper works torn by the violence of the strain. We had the perpetual severities of a rigorous climate to cope with. Our seamen and officers were exposed to rain, sleet, hail, and snow. Our rigging was constantly encrusted with ice, which cut the hands of those who were obliged to touch it. Our provision of fresh water was to be collected in lumps of ice floating on the sea, when the cold and the saline element alternately numbed and scarified our sailors' hands, and so on. In fact, the ship had sailed into the Antarctic Ocean. The discomforts which the landsman exaggerates into miseries were hardly noticed by the sailors. The voyage was dangerous, but not more disagreeable than Cook had so often experienced, for fog, sleet, and snow off the coast of Labrador. And as for the cold, of which Forster complains so much, the thermometer hardly ever sank below freezing point. But this author's main object was to write up the dangers and the miseries he had experienced. Everything was exaggerated with the view of effect. March 26th, 1773. After a run of 3,500 leagues and 122 days, the ship put in at Dusky Bay, New Zealand. Here they made tea and a kind of beer from the leaves of a shrub of the myrtle kind. Cook surveyed the coasts of New Zealand until June 7th, meeting his consort the Adventure, from which they had been parted after leaving the Cape in Queen Charlotte's Sound. Forster's account of New Zealand and the people is highly picturesque and pleasing. June 7th, sailed for Otaheite. On the way, scurvy broke out on board the Adventure. Sighted several small islands. Arrived at Otaheite on August 16th. Forster gives his pen a fuller freedom over this delightful island. At their approach, faint breezes wafted delicious perfumes from the land and curled the surface of the sea. The mountains rose majestic in various spiry forms. Everything seemed as yet asleep. The morning scarce dawned, and a peaceful shade still rested in the landscape. Never surely has any island been more described than Otaheite. The most important part of Wallace's narrative is that given to Otaheite. There are at least 4 long sections in Cook's 3 voyages devoted to this island. Forster exhausts himself over it. Gilbert, to whom we shall presently come, can find no words to express his admiration of the place and the people. What is most remarkable is the fact that every one of these accounts is separately and individually interesting. They supplement each other. The following general account of the people by Forster seems to represent the emotion of the writer in recalling a fond memory of the delightful place he would never be privileged to visit again. Scientifically, it is vague. The men are all well proportioned, and some would have been selected by Phidias or Praxiteles as models of masculine beauty. Their features are sweet and unruffled by violent passions. Their large eyes, their arched eyebrows, and high forehead give a noble air to their heads, which are adorned by strong beards and a comely growth of hair. The sex, the partners of their felicity, are likewise well formed. Their irregular charms win the heart of their countrymen, and their unaffected smiles and a wish to please ensure them mutual esteem and love. A kind of happy uniformity runs through the whole life of the Tahitians. They arise with the sun and hasten to rivers and fountains to perform an ablution equally reviving and cleanly. They pass the morning at work, or walk about till the heat of the day increases, when they retreat to their dwellings or repose under some tufted tree. There they amuse themselves with smoothing their hair and anoint it with fragrant oils, or they blow the flute and sing to it, or listen to the song of the birds. At the hour of noon or a little later they go to dinner. After their meals they resume their domestic amusements, during which the flame of mutual affection spreads in every heart and unites the rising generation with new and tender ties. The lively jest without any ill nature, the artless tale, the jocund dance and frugal supper bring in the evening, and another visit to the river concludes the actions of the day. Thus contented with their simple way of life, and placed in a delightful country, they are free from cares and happy in their ignorance. Ihr Leben fließet verborgen, wie klare Bäche durch Blumen dahin. September 1st. Left Otaheite. Cruised among the other islands of the group. Discovered Harvey's Islands, visited Middleburg and Amsterdam. November 3rd. Arrived again at Queen Charlotte's Sound. November 26th. Sailed from New Zealand on the second voyage into the Antarctic Ocean. The captain's account of this voyage reads as if everything was as comfortable and everybody as cheerful as could be desired. Alas, to Forster and his father, and perhaps the learned Dr. Sparrman, things looked very different. There was on board, he admits, little scurvy, and everybody drank quantities of the fresh wort. On the other hand, there was a general languor and a sickly look on every person's countenance, which threatened us with more dangerous consequences. Evidently he was one of those who are always thinking of the more dangerous consequences. Captain Cook himself was likewise pale and lean, and entirely lost his appetite. His father, with 12 others on board, was afflicted with rheumatic pains. Our situation at present — see how a sailor will hide the truth — the captain says nothing of these dreadful things — was indeed very dismal, even to those who preserved the blessing of health. To the sick, whose crippled limbs were tortured with excessive pain, it was insupportable. The ocean about us had a furious aspect, and seemed incensed at the presumption of a few intruding mortals. A gloomy, melancholy air lowered on the brows of our shipmates, and a dreadful silence reigned amongst us. Salt meat, our constant diet, was become loathsome to all, even to those who had been bred to a nautical life from their tenderest years. The hour of dinner was hateful to us. The captain seemed to recover as we advanced to the southward. The italics are mine. On January 30th, 1774, they reached in latitude 71 degrees 10 minutes south, longitude 106 degrees 54 minutes west, for the second time, the great southern wall of ice. I do not know whether any better description exists of this barrier than the following, written by the captain himself. On the 30th, at 4 o'clock in the morning, we perceived the clouds over the horizon to the south to be of an unusual snow-white brightness, which we knew announced our approach to field ice. Soon after it was seen from the top masthead, and at 8 o'clock we were close to its edge. It extended east and west, far beyond the reach of our sight. In the situation we were in, just the southern half of our horizon was illuminated by the rays of light reflected from the ice to a considerable height. 97 ice hills were distinctly seen within the field, besides those on the outside, many of them very large and looking like a ridge of mountains rising one above another, till they were lost in the clouds. The outer or northern edge of this immense field was composed of loose or broken ice close packed together, so that it was not possible for anything to enter it. This was about a mile broad, within which was solid ice in one continued compact body. It was rather low and flat, except the hills, but seemed to increase in height as you traced it to the south, in which direction it extended beyond our sight. Such mountains of ice as these, I think, were never seen in the Greenland seas, at least not that I ever heard or read of, so that we cannot draw a comparison between the ice here and there. It must be allowed that these prodigious ice mountains must add such additional weight to the ice fields which enclose them, as cannot but make a great difference between the navigating this icy sea and that of Greenland. I will not say that it was impossible anywhere to get farther to the south, but attempting it would have been a dangerous and rash enterprise, and which I believe no man in my situation would have thought of. It was indeed my opinion, as well as the opinion of most on board, that this ice extended quite to the pole, or perhaps joined on some land to which it had been fixed from the earliest time, and that it is here, that is, to the south of this parallel, where all the ice we find scattered up and down to the north is first formed, and afterwards broken off by gales of wind or other causes, and brought to the north by the currents, which are always found to set in that direction in high latitudes. As we drew near this ice, some penguins were heard, but none seen, and but few other birds or anything that could induce us to think any land was near. And yet I think that there must be some to the south behind this ice, but if there is, it can afford no better retreat for birds or any other animals than the ice itself, with which it must be wholly covered. I, who had ambition not only to go farther than any one had been before, but as far as it was possible for man to go, was not sorry at meeting with this interruption, as it in some measure relieved us, at least, shortened the dangers and hardships inseparable from navigation of the southern polar regions. Since, therefore, we could not proceed 1 inch farther to the south, no other reason need be assigned for my tacking and standing back to the north. They therefore steered north, the captain's intention being to fix the longitude of Juan Fernandez and to visit Davis Land or Easter Island. On the way he fell ill of what he calls a bilious colic. After his fashion he disposes of this little event in a dozen lines. Forster, however, makes a great deal more of it, and despite his tendency to write up everything, shows very clearly that the captain, tough as he was sick nigh unto death. In order to give him what was most necessary for his recovery, a dog was killed, and a broth of the fresh meat made for him. The illness of the captain was followed by that of the doctor, but fortunately Easter Island was reached, and fresh food was procured again. This interesting place, with its curious sculptures, some of which are now in the British Museum, is described very well both by Cook himself and by Forster. Leaving Easter Island, the ships visited the Marquesas, whose position Cook desired to fix, discovered Hood's Island and Palliser's Island, and once more arrived at Otaheite, to the renewed joy of all on board. Forster, who was classical, exclaimed, "Ille terrarum mihi praeter omnes angulus ridit." And the old free and easy life, which the captain made no attempt to restrain, began again, insomuch that, as Forster says, they resembled the happy indolent people whom Ulysses found in Phaeacia, and could apply the poet's lines to themselves with peculiar propriety. To dress, to dance, to sing our sole delight, the feast or bath by day, and love by night. On May 15th, 1774, they left this earthly paradise. In the course of this voyage they visit Huaheine, Howe Island, Rotterdam or Anamuka, discovered by Tasman, and discovered Palmerston Island, Savage Island, Malacolo, Shepherd's Islands, the Sandwich Islands, Erromango, Tanna Island, New Caledonia, of which they explored the southwest coast, and Norfolk Island. A very considerable and memorable voyage by itself, the particulars of which will be found in the narrative. On October 17th they sighted New Zealand. On November 10th they sailed from New Zealand and continued without seeing any land till December 17th. After giving 3 weeks to the examination of Staatenland and the islands around it, Cook sailed on his third and last attempt to find the southern continent, though with no thought of finding it. He did not find it. He discovered the island of Georgia covered over in the middle of the Antarctic summer with ice and snow. He also observed certain headlands and found an islet or two. Then, as on the 2 previous occasions, Cook consented to return northwards when he could get no farther south. He had now completely circumnavigated the globe in or near the Antarctic Circle. He had traversed the Southern Ocean in all directions and had found no southern continent anywhere. He now returned to the Cape and so home, well satisfied, we may suppose, with his success. Looking into Forster for the humbler details, we find that during the whole of the last run the crew lived chiefly on the fish which they had salted at New Zealand. The salt beef and pork were so universally loathed that even the captain himself declared he should never again eat it with any degree of satisfaction. The sauerkraut continued to be used, and the wort was still taken as a preventive. But early in February 1775 the sauerkraut was finished, fortunately not long before the end of the southern exploration. On the morning of Sunday, July 30th, 1775, the ships dropped anchor at Spithead. "It doth not become me," Cook sums up, "to say how far the principal objects of our voyage have been obtained, though it hath not abounded with remarkable events, nor been diversified by sudden transitions of fortune, though my relation of it has been more employed in tracing our course by sea than in recording our observations on shore. This perhaps is a circumstance from which the curious reader may infer that the purposes for which we were sent into the southern hemisphere were diligently and effectually pursued. Had we found out a continent, There we might have been better enabled to gratify curiosity, but we hope our not having found it, after all our persevering researches, will leave less room for future speculations about unknown worlds remaining to be explored. These are modest words. Let us see what Forster says in conclusion. Thus, after escaping innumerable dangers and suffering a long series of hardships, we happily completed a voyage that lasted 3 years and 16 days, in the course of which, it is computed, we ran over a greater space of sea than any ship ever did before us, since, taking all our tracks together, they form more than thrice the circumference of the globe. We were likewise fortunate enough to lose only 4 men, 3 of whom died by accident, and 1 by a disease which would perhaps have brought him to the grave much sooner had he continued in England. The principal view of our expedition, the travel after a southern continent within the bounds of the temperate zone, was fulfilled. We had even searched the frozen seas of the opposite hemisphere within the Antarctic Circle, without meeting with the vast tract of land which had formerly been supposed to exist. At the same time we made another discovery important to science, that nature forms great masses of ice in the midst of the wide ocean, which are destitute of any saline particles, but have all the useful and salubrious properties of the pure element. At other seasons we explored the Pacific Ocean, between the tropics and in the temperate zone, and then furnished geographers with new islands, naturalists with plants and birds, and above all the friends of mankind with various modifications of human nature. End of section 13. Section 14 of Captain Cook by Walter Besant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9. Last Stay at Home. Cook was now at home again for the last time. A simple sum in addition shows that though he was married for nearly 17 years, his whole residence at home amounted to no more than 4 years and 4 months, out of which must be deducted the time necessary for the outfit of his vessel and all the business of preparing his expeditions. In his public capacity, however, on his return home from the second voyage, he received all the honours which it was the fashion of the time to bestow. In these days he would have been made Rear Admiral, with Knight Commander of the Bath, or perhaps Knight Grand Cross of the Bath. He would have been presented to the Queen. He would have read a paper at the Royal Geographical Society. He would have been the lion of the season. He would have been invited to take the chair of 100 meetings. He would also have been implored by the editors of all the magazines to contribute an article, and after sending in his official report to Government, he would have drawn up a narrative of his voyage to be published on his own account, out of which he would have made a considerable sum of money. 100 years ago simpler methods obtained. This man, who had done more for geography and seamanship, more in his voyages than any other man who lived since Columbus, was promoted to the rank of post captain. He was also appointed a captain in Greenwich Hospital, a post which provided for him a retreat for life if he pleased to remain there. He was also elected Fellow of the Royal Society in February 1776. On the day of his election 2 papers of his, communicated to the President, Sir John Pringle, were read to the Society. One of these was on the action of the tides along the east coast of New Holland, the other on the preservation of the health of the crew on long voyages. There can be no doubt that the successful prosecution of this voyage raised Cook to a position of the highest respect in his own country, where a man so seldom becomes a prophet. In other countries, at least in France, Holland, Spain, and Russia, he was regarded as the greatest navigator of all time. It is significant of the general feeling that the gold medal of the Royal Society, which is annually awarded to the best experimental research of the year, was in 1776 bestowed upon Captain Cook for his paper on the preservation of the sailors from scurvy. On the day of presentation he had already sailed. He doubtless knew that the honour was intended for him. He could not hear the oration which the President pronounced upon the occasion. Cook was now in the 48th year of his age. He had been at sea for 34 years. This is a long time of service. No man under 50 had worked harder. No living man had achieved so much. Other men had been shipwrecked and cast away. Plenty of men had encountered perils of every kind. None so many perils or so various as Captain Cook. He might have hung up his oar. There was a safe haven in which he might rest without loss of honour, or without incurring the slightest blame or the least imputation upon his courage. He had done enough. As for what might remain of life, he could have spent it blamelessly in the snug retreat at Greenwich Hospital with his wife and children. He would have awaited the approach of age with a serene conscience, as one who had run a good race and fought a good fight. He could have walked upon the terrace and seen the ships go up and down, the king's ships, sailing out on a new voyage of discovery, to encounter the coral reefs of New Holland and the hurricane of the tropics and the ice fields of the Arctic or Antarctic circles. It would have reminded him of his own 2 voyages. Then he would have told the old tales again, and recalled the soft airs and gentle folk of far-away Tahiti. Why could he not sit down and rest? Besides, he was now a great gentleman, a post-captain in the Royal Navy. He who had once been the collier's ship-boy, everybody's servant, cuffed and kicked and ordered about by every common sailor in the vessel. He who had been born in the farm labourer's cottage, and had been taught the criss-cross row by a kind lady out of charity. He now enjoyed the society of the greatest scholars and philosophers of his time. He sat at great men's tables. He was called friend by those, his patrons, to whom under less favourable conditions he would have been a servant. He had conquered fortune. He possessed all that life can give a man. Why not sit down and rest and enjoy these things? Fame, sufficiency, rank in his profession, and friendship of the best, what more can mortal man desire? But he could not rest. That habit of incessant work was too deep-seated to be thrown off. Besides, Cook at 48 was as young as many men at 30. He had lived a life so hard and simple, it had been so free from vice or excess of any kind. He was born with a constitution so magnificent that as yet he felt no touch of age. Besides, he who roves must still be roving. The nomad is easily awakened. He who begins to travel can never afterwards sit still. In this age, the man who undertakes one journey to Africa is wedded to that continent for life. In that age, he who had once breathed the soft airs of the Pacific must needs go back again. Thus Cook took with him on his second voyage not only men who had been with him on the first, but also men who had been with Wallis. As for himself, he eagerly embraced the chance of making the second voyage, and when he was consulted about finding an officer to command the third, his pulse quickened, his blood warmed, and he offered to go yet a third time. The Pacific had been kinder to him than to any previous navigators. She suffered him to go back in safety once, twice, not a third time. Yet if a vision had been granted to Cook before he volunteered, showing him the fatal and ignoble quarrel in which he was to fall, he would still have persevered, seeing how great would be his name and fame. The question of the southern continent was finally settled. There would be no more wrangling over that. There was no southern continent, or if there should prove to be one, it was more inaccessible than Greenland, more inhospitable than the northern coasts of Labrador. It lay behind vast walls and hills of ice, unmelted and unbroken in the height of summer. If any human beings lived there, they must be lower than the Eskimo, more wretched than the Fuegian. But there was another question, open and disputed. It had been under dispute for 200 years. Only in our own days has it been finally settled, and even now it can hardly be considered wholly cleared up, while there remain so many islands whose coasts are as yet unexamined. It was the question of the Northwestern Passage. This question belongs as much to this century as to the last or the two preceding. It need not be considered with the detail which the history of discovery in the Pacific Ocean seemed to demand. The search for the Northwestern Passage is, like many scientific searches, one after a thing either impossible to find or useless when found, the pursuit of which yielded results of quite unexpected and of incalculable value. It was hoped to find a short and easy way of sailing to China and the Far East on the north of the American continent, and so to avoid the long passage by the Cape of Good Hope. How long and tedious the passage was is proved by the fact that on the second voyage Cook was 120 days sailing from Madeira to the Cape. The expeditions sent out in the 16th and 17th centuries failed, it is true, to find the passage, but they succeeded in revealing an immense amount of territory in America and a great portion of her northern shores. In the middle of the 18th century the subject was revived, especially by one Dobbs. In the year 1741 Captain Middleton was sent out, and in 1746 Captains Smith and Moore. An Act of Parliament was passed offering a reward of £20,000 to the owners of a ship which should discover the passage, or to the captain, officers, and company of the fortunate ship if it should belong to the Royal Navy. Lord Mulgrave also attempted in the year 1773 to reach the North Pole. The continual failure of every expedition caused a change of plans. It was then argued that where ships had failed to get through from the Atlantic to the Pacific, they might succeed from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and Lord Sandwich was so far persuaded that an attempt in this direction might prove successful that he consented to send out an expedition with this object. Captain Cook would have been appointed to the command without the least hesitation, but for a natural feeling that he had done enough and should now be left to repose. However, whether with the view of sounding him, or whether only to consult him, he was invited to dine with Lord Sandwich, and with him were invited his old friends and patrons, Sir Hugh Palliser and Mr. Stevens, Secretary of the Admiralty. During dinner the conversation turned upon the projected expedition, its importance, its dangers, and the benefits which might follow upon its success. Fired once more by the enthusiasm of the navigator, Cook sprang to his feet and offered to take the command. His offer was accepted, with the promise that on his return he should be reappointed to his place at Greenwich Hospital. One domestic detail of this time survives. Cook concealed from his wife, so long as he could, the fact that he had promised to try fortune yet once more on the Pacific Main. How long he could keep the thing a secret one cannot learn. As he received his commission in February and began at once to enter men, it could not have been long. Yet to the end his widow lamented that his acceptance of the command had been kept from her. Considering that his youngest child Hugh was born just after the ship sailed, he may have thought there was good reason not to agitate his wife with any anxieties, but to break the news to her when the whole business was settled. It is not certain whether he had by this time taken up his official residence in Greenwich Hospital, or whether his wife and family continued to live there until the fatal news arrived. Perhaps they went on living in Mile End Old Town. From recollections preserved by his widow of dinners at great houses during this last stay at home, it would seem as if they had now left that modest suburb. End of section 14. Section 15 of Captain Cook by Walter Besant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10. The Third Voyage, Part 1. The Resolution was again chosen for the voyage, and with her the discovery of 300 tons. Clark, second lieutenant in the former voyage, was put in command of the smaller vessel. Others who had already sailed with Cook joined this expedition, among them Anderson, surgeon and naturalist, who proved to be the most minute observer and the best linguist of the company, Lieutenant King, who afterwards succeeded to the command of the Discovery and had charge of the astronomical and nautical instruments on board the Resolution, while Mr. Bailey, who had been on the second voyage, again went out on board the Discovery as astronomer. Several of the petty officers had also sailed on the second voyage. There were more officers in proportion than was usual in a ship of the Royal Navy. The Resolution had 3 lieutenants, the Discovery 2, and other officers in proportion. This was a practice commonly observed in long and dangerous voyages, partly with the view of easily putting down any attempt at mutiny. Cook, however, states that he brought with him officers for the special service of constructing charts, taking views of coasts and headlands, and drawing surveys of bays and harbours. An artist, Weber, went with them to make drawings of the places where they should touch. The best known portrait of Cook is by Weber. Omai, the Tahitian, who had been brought to England in the last voyage, also went out with Cook, to be landed on his native shore. He was laden with presents of all kinds. In respect of wages, the ships were put upon the establishments of sloops of war. As for the sailing instructions, they may be summed up in general terms. The commander was to find a north-east passage from the Pacific to the Atlantic if possible. He was also to get together every kind of information in geography, in tides, currents, shoals, rocks, harbours, depths and soundings, natural productions, fruits, grains, minerals, metals and people. He was also to take possession, with the consent of the natives, a charming touch of official hypocrisy, in the name of the King of Great Britain and Ireland, of convenient situations in such countries as may be discovered, and so on. With these instructions, and fully equipped, the expedition set sail from Plymouth Sound on July 11th. The following is the skeleton route of this voyage. February 6th, 1776. Commission to command the Resolution received by Captain Cook. He went on board and began to enter men. The Discovery, 300 tons, also purchased, and command given to Captain Clark. May 29th. Sailed to Longreach. June 25th. Weighed anchor and made sail for the Downs. July 11th. Sailed from Plymouth. August 1st through 4th. Tenerife. October 18th through November 30th. Table Bay. December 12th. Islands discovered by Marion and Crozet, named by Cook Prince Edward Island, Marion's and Crozet's Islands. December 24th through 30th. Kerguelen Island, Christmas Harbour, examined and explored. January 24th, 1777. Van Diemen's Land, Adventure Bay. February 10th. New Zealand. February 11th through 25th. Queen Charlotte Sound. February 29th. Mangia Island, discovered and visited. April 1st. Watia, discovered and visited. April 4th. Wainuete, discovered and visited. April 6th. Harvey's Island, visited. April 13th. Palmerston Island, found to be a group of small islets. April 24th. Passed Savage Island. April 28th. Anamango, Comango, and Falafajuca. April 29th. Anamuka, Friendly Islands. May 17th. Hepai. May 21st. Lafuga, Friendly Islands to nearly due south. May 22nd. Tongatabu. The Society Islands, including August 12th, Tahiti, September 30th, Eimeo, October 12th, Huahaine, and December 8th, Bola Bola. January 20th, 1778. Atui and Onehio, Sandwich Islands. March 7th, Coast of America. April 24th, Nootka Sound. May 11th, Kays Island. June 19th, Selenmogen's Islands. June 27th, Unalashka. August 3rd, Death of Anderson, surgeon and naturalist. July 9th. Cape Prince of Wales, most westerly point of North America. Spent July chiefly in sailing about open sea beyond Bering Straits. Corporal Lydiard in Kippis. October 26th. Sailed for Sandwich Islands. November 26th. Discovered Maui. November 30th. Discovered Hawaii. February 14th, 1779. Cook killed. August 2nd. Clark died of consumption. Gore took command of the Resolution. King of the Discovery. October 4th, 1780. Arrived at the Nore. During the voyage, the Resolution lost 5 men by sickness, 3 of whom were ill at start. The Discovery lost none. The account of this voyage, from which the 2 captains never returned, was published in 3 volumes quarto, the first and second from the log books and journals of Captain Cook, and the third by Captain King, who succeeded Captain Clark in command of the Discovery. Dr. Douglas, Bishop of Salisbury, edited the work. Unfortunately, he also doctored it, and though he says in his introduction that Cook's journal was faithfully adhered to, he also owns to incorporating a quantity of matter from Anderson's journal. To prevent the possibility of mistake, the editor submitted the first 2 volumes to King, who is entirely responsible for the third. All that the editor has to answer for are the notes occasionally introduced in the course of the 2 volumes, contributed by Captain Cook, and the introduction. It is, however, quite clear that many portions of the work have been rewritten or touched, not, it is true, in the lumbering style of Dr. Hawkesworth, but still touched. The straightforward directness and simplicity of Cook's own narrative of the second voyage are gone. The venerable and learned bishop could not understand that it was his religious duty to present the very words of the dead navigator. These given without alteration, he was at liberty to add what notes he pleased, and to enrich the work with Anderson's observations, which are certainly admirable, but not to incorporate them with the body of the work, so that the reader is dragged from Cook to Anderson, and from Anderson to Cook. The editor afterwards acknowledges also that Captain King gave advice and directions in a variety of instances when the journal required explanations. Lieutenant Roberts was also frequently consulted, and particular obligations are due to Mr. Wallace, who cheerfully took upon himself the trouble of digesting from the log books the tables of the route of the ships. One Mr. Wegg also assisted, and the Honourable Mr. Davies Barrington, and Mr. Tennant and Mr. Bryant, who followed Captain Cook in his study. In fact, a large number of eminent hands assisted in the production of the work, and if, after so much assistance, there is still much of the original journal left, we ought to be thankful to the editor. I have before me, however, a journal of the voyage, which has never before been published, kept by George Gilbert of the Resolution. He appears to have gone out as master's mate or midshipman on board the Discovery. By the successive deaths of Captain Cook and Captain Clark, he was promoted to be lieutenant. George Gilbert's father had been master on the Endeavour during the first voyage, and on the Resolution during the second. He retired from active service and lived at Fareham in Hampshire to the age of 91. His son, who on the return of the expedition received promotion, died of smallpox immediately afterwards. The journal fell into the possession of the late Dr. Doran, whose wife belonged to the Gilbert family. It has been most kindly lent to me with the permission to use it for this volume by Mr. Alban Doran. Many details of interest which are omitted in the official journals have been preserved in this log. I propose to follow the voyage, the route of which has been given above, with the assistance of Mr. Gilbert of the Resolution, partly because Cook's own account, as we have seen, has been so much edited, and partly because this narrative is at least new, while Cook's, doctored by the bishop and his friends, has been in the hands of the world for 100 years. All the voyages of the latter half of the last century, as I have already said, lie on the borderland between the ancient and the modern. We are as yet too near the navigators of the time to feel the charm of adventure as we feel it in the voyages of Drake and Raleigh, or later in those of Dampier. They belong to a trying period in the history of a book of travel. 100 years more, and Cook will have become, as he really was, the last of the old navigators, the successor, the last in the long list of Magellan, Tasman, Quiros, Drake, and the rest. 100 years more, and Cook's descriptions of the Polynesians and Australians will be invaluable as a record of things long since passed away. Even the people of the islands will have disappeared. There will not be a single survivor of the friendly islanders, or of the gentle natives of Tahiti, or of the fierce warriors of New Zealand. As for information or observation on the manners and customs of the natives, Gilbert's journal affords little or none that is new. On the contrary, his remarks concerning them are of the briefest. Evidently he, and with him the great body of the officers, had no training as to the value of such observations or the method of making them. Anderson, for instance, furnishes many pages on the Tasmanians, and has put together a short vocabulary of their language. Gilbert sums them up quite in the proverbial style. They wear no clothes and are not ashamed. They know no arts. Except the natives of Terra del Fuego, they are supposed to be the most ignorant race of people existing, which is quite enough attention for a British officer to bestow upon these people. Let us run through the journal and select those passages which supplement and illustrate Cook and King, and throw light on the daily life and conversation of the officers and men. At Queen Charlotte's Sound the New Zealanders can hardly be persuaded to come on board, probably in fear of retaliation for the murder of the Adventure's men 3 years before. "I think," says Gilbert, "that nothing can be a greater proof of their treachery than their suspecting it in us." In Cook's account we presently read that he went ashore with a party of men in 5 boats to collect food for the cattle. The reason for this exhibition of strength is thus given in Gilbert's log. The spelling of the gallant officer is preserved in this extract, but modernized in those that follow. "A boat was sent every day to different parts of the Sound with 8 or 10 people to cut grass for the cattle. I was in that party, and it was lucky for us that we never met with any of the natives, for though we had arms with us, yet they might have rushed from the woods and cut us off, the ship not being able to give us any assistance. One day when we were at Long Island, a quarrel happened at the ship with the natives, when an old man came on board and told Captain Cook that some of his countrymen had a design upon our boat. At the same time they saw 3 or 4 large canoes full of men going over to where the boat was, sent from the ship manned and armed to bring us intelligence and see whether anything had happened. She arrived in time, for we had seen nothing of the natives, but however we were ordered to come on board. The next day Captain Cook made an excursion up the Sound with 5 boats and 50 or 60 men well armed to cut grass. We went up about 12 miles and cut 2 boatloads. On our return we put into Grass Cove, the place where the Adventure's boat's crew, consisting of a mate, a midshipman, and 8 men, were cut off and ate upon the spot by the natives. No place could be more favourable for such intentions, as the wood was so thick that the natives could approach close to them before they were discovered. We saw 4 or 5 of them, who, seeing our numbers, were afraid to come near us, till we made them to understand that we had no intentions to hurt them. We had reasons to believe there were a great number of them in the woods, as those with us frequently called to them. We returned to the ship that night. End of section 15.